Tonight, BET brings together some of the most influential politicians in the nation to address one of America's most important issues, the continuing crisis of mass incarceration.
Our criminal justice system feeds upon the most vulnerable in this country.
Let's speak truth and let that inform public policy.
Millions of Americans locked away behind bars, millions more on parole and probation. Even our youth are targeted and incarcerated. The systems of cash bail, parole and probation disproportionately impacting our communities.
The money and job opportunities that I lost.
Now, new voices are calling for change.
I'm here to speak for the people who don't have a voice.
There have even been first steps to reform.
This legislation will help thousands of former inmates and nonviolent offenders.
But what are the next steps that need to take place? There is still much urgent work to be done. This is American Injustice, a special BET Town Hall event. From Washington, your host, Soledad O'Brien.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight from our nation's capital. We're here to focus on an issue that continues to impact so many in our communities. The issue is mass incarceration. There are currently more than 2 million Americans who are locked up in our nation's prisons and jails, and 4.5 million are on probation or parole. A disproportionate number are Black. A consequence, many say, of a system rooted in racism and inequality. So tonight we have gathered some of the most influential leaders in Washington, D.C. to talk about the future of criminal justice reform in America. With us today, Congresswoman Karen Bass of California. She is the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus and was a co-sponsor of the First Step Act, the criminal justice reform bill signed into law in December. Congresswoman Bass is currently serving her 5th term in Congress. To welcome Senator Cory Booker of New Jersey. Senator Booker was one of the first visible supporters of the First Step Act in the Senate, and when he was the mayor of Newark, New Jersey, he championed criminal justice reform. In February, Senator Booker formally announced that he is running for president. Congresswoman Val Demings of Florida is with us. Before joining Congress, she served in law enforcement for 27 years and became the first female chief of the Orlando Police Department. She's been a strong advocate for enhancing relationships between the police and the communities they serve. Pleased to have Senator Kamala Harris with us from the state of California. She previously served as that state's Attorney General and the District Attorney of San Francisco. Senator Harris officially launched her campaign for the presidency in January. Welcome. Welcome to all of you. We have a lot to cover tonight. We're going to talk about juvenile justice. We're going to talk about cash bail. We're going to talk about probation. We're going to talk about parole. But my very first question actually goes to our audience. I would like to see, by a show of hands, how many of you would say you have been personally affected in some way by mass incarceration? Just raise your hand. Wow. I think that, which is a large number of people, really reflects what we know about mass incarceration in the United States. It affects everyone. Let's talk first and foremost about this landmark criminal justice bill, the criminal justice reform bill. It was signed into law by President Trump in December. It's called the First Step Act. I'm going to have you, Congresswoman Bass, walk us through the bipartisan nature of this act, because many people have pointed out that it actually was critical that both sides, if you will, wanted to push this through.
Exactly. And I think we're at a moment in history that we need to take advantage of this. Now, both sides come together for different reasons. I think on the Republican side, they're very concerned about how much money is spent, how much money is dumped into the criminal justice system. And then on the Democratic side, I think it's much more of a social justice perspective. And even some of my Republican colleagues, and you guys would probably agree, begin to recognize the injustice, especially now since there's an opioid crisis, because the opioid crisis is impacting the white population, and then, you know, the Republicans are not too many Black and brown folks on the Republican side. So I think that they have a new awareness to the injustice side of it because of the opioid crisis specifically.
Senator Booker, walk us through what this bill actually does.
Well, it has a number of components of it, or areas of work, and first and foremost, it deals with the sentencing side and giving more flexibility to judges, lowering some mandatory minimums, making some first steps in reversing what we've seen that really has led to a 800% increase in the federal prison population since 1980 alone. Then it does some reforms inside prisons themselves, giving people the opportunity to earn themselves out, stopping some horrific practices like shackling of pregnant women, juvenile solitary confinement, some elements that I really pushed to get into this bill. And then it does some things on the release side as well, and helping people when they're coming home find more justice, because we all know we have a system that even after you've served a sentence, often an unjust sentence, you come home and now even more doors are closed to you. So helping people with their ease and transition back into society.
Critics would say we're talking about federal, which means that you're talking about 181,000 people roughly who are in the federal court system, which is kind of a drop in the bucket when you're really talking about multiple millions of people who are dealing.
I feel that way as a drop in the bucket, but you know, let's just take one thing this bill did, which is the horrible crack cocaine, powder cocaine disparities, which are still bad, but they were changed from 100 to 1 to 18 to 1, but it wasn't made retroactive. So you had these people serving exorbitantly long sentences, 90% of whom were African American. And so what it did is it gave those folks a pathway out of prison, already people being liberated. So I think everybody on the stage would agree it was just a step in a very long journey, first step. But to the thousands of people, literally tens of thousands of people that will be affected, it's substantive, it's real, and it's something that we shouldn't shortchange.
Congressman Demings, the bill had a kind of a tortured path to the president's desk to be signed. As a police chief formerly in Orlando, what's law enforcement's take in the big picture on criminal justice reform? Generally for it, pushing against it?
Well, I think those of us who've worked in law enforcement clearly understand that our criminal justice system is not perfect. And when we look at the disparities between African Americans or people of color and others, then we all understand that we need to do a better job. And I think it is very important to remember that this is just the beginning. But this law, while it only, as you mentioned, only 180,000 people, some people have already benefited from this law that was just signed into law a few months ago.
Senator Harris, much has been written about what the law does not do. Where does there need to be more? Where does the law fall short?
Well, what I would propose is the second step needs to have as a priority making the advances around sentencing reform retroactive. There are a lot of folks who are currently incarcerated who are not going to benefit from the law. The second point is that it deals with a lot that happens post-conviction and sentencing. But there are a whole lot of people caught in the system pre-trial who are in a system that has been unjust as it relates to, for example, bail. I have a bill that would reform the money bail system in our country, recognizing that this is not only a criminal justice issue, it's an economic justice issue. People are sitting in jail in America at a cost of tens of millions of dollars a day because they simply can't afford to pay to get out pending trial, which could be days, weeks, months, and even years. And we need to take a look at that as well. So
much to be done still. For example, I believe the bill didn't take aim at the nation's school-to-prison pipeline, really, and that was another gap. And we know that too many young people who are brown and black, often their first interaction with the criminal justice system actually starts in school. I want to show you a clip from BET's docuseries. It's called Finding Justice. Take a look.
I was in school one day, and these people came into the classroom, and they were like, you, and you, let's go. And the thing that they picked up was my hand sanitizer, and I was like, I need that. And they're like, oh no, I know your type. You're gonna use it to get high. And now at this point, I'm kind of thinking, what's my type? It makes me feel targeted. My skin color, I can't control that. You're criminalizing me based off of stuff I don't control. Random searches make me not want to go to school at all, but I've always told myself I want to make a difference. My existence is gonna mean something. And now what you're telling me is I ain't gonna be nothing but a criminal, so I might as well start acting like one.
If You identify black and brown kids with a presumption of dangerousness and guilt. Then, of course, school officials call the police into the schools to arrest and detain those children. You label them as criminal. And that mindset is at the heart of what has become the school-to-prison pipeline.
Marche Doss, who was featured in that clip, is here with us today. Marche, would you do me a favor and stand up so we can recognize you? Thanks for being with us. I know you have a question for our panelists. Go ahead.
So my question to you all is, do you plan to help end the hyper-policing in schools, and how exactly do you plan to do that?
Who wants to tackle that first?
I'll tackle that. Let me just say, when school resource officers were first put into our high schools, they were really put there to help to improve the relationship between our children and the police. They were not initially put into schools to actually take police action against the children. And I think the schools have really, let me put it this way, the schools need to do a better job in terms of dealing with behaviors that are not violations of law. I think that former Chief David Brown from Dallas Police Department said it best when he said that the police are called for everything, including when school rules are broken and not necessarily violations of law. Schools need to do a better job in terms of doing assessments, dealing with things like bullying and acting out in class, or children who are told to go to the principal's office, for example, and fail to do that. And the police can be about the business of really teaching you how to be safe in your home, in your school, in your environment, as opposed to dealing with you in a law enforcement-related circumstance.
I really think we have an opportunity to question the whole system, because I think in addition to schools, we need to question the notion of status offenses. Why are you subject to arrest for things like truancy or cutting class? I did a study once years ago and found that one of the entry points to the school to prison pipeline was truancy tickets. So you might get a ticket, it goes into a warrant, and you might not want to tell your parents. But we need to look at a lot of different places in our system. Why would you kick a kid out for willful defiance? Why would you kick a kid out, period? Because if you send them away from school, then what do you expect for them to do, especially when their parents are there?
We've got much more to discuss about the future of criminal justice reform. The BET Town Hall American Injustice will continue right after this short break. We're back in just a moment.
From the nation's capital, you are watching American Injustice at BET Town Hall.
Welcome back, everybody. From juvenile justice to cash bail, many of you might know that 60% of people who are in jail haven't been convicted of a crime. Many remain stuck behind bars just because they can't afford bail. The BET docuseries Finding Justice examined the stories of people who are trapped by the cash bail system. People like Inez Bordeaux, who, after being arrested on fraud charges, faced bail that was just impossible to pay.
One mistake and your whole entire life can be erased. There was a bail hearing and the judge set my bail at $25,000. Cash only. I don't have $25,000. I don't know anybody that has $25,000. I lost my house. I lost my car. I lost my kids. For nothing.
Judges set bails for black defendants almost $10,000 higher than for white defendants. As atrocious as this may sound to everybody, and you're right, it is, it's just normal practice for the system.
When we're talking about cash bail bonds and reform, change is possible. But interestingly enough, the number of cities that are unwilling to do it, it's not based on crime numbers. It's based on the impact on their city's budget.
Inez Bordeaux is with us, and I saw you crying as you watched yourself on camera. Will you stand up for us, Inez? And I want people to understand where your situation is now. The state Supreme Court cleared your case. All your charges have been dropped, but you still have felt the impact.
Yeah, I've still felt the impact. My life will never be the same. Not ever.
I know you have a question for the panel.
In St. Louis, where I'm from, we're ending cash bail, and we're closing a jail called the Workhouse. And already we're seeing an attempt by judges and prosecutors to rely on risk assessment and electronic monitoring, both of which we know are detrimental to our communities and further marginalize us. All of these things are very prominent in the First Step Act that all of you work together to pass. As someone who is interested in the liberation of Black people and determined not to support policies that we later have to dismantle, my question is, how do you reimagine public safety without overly criminalizing Black people in our communities?
For many communities, cash bail is a way to make money for the city.
Right, but I think what she's talking about, which is something that Marche brought up as well, is the effect that race plays within many of these contexts. Marche, you should know that from the preschool level, you're in high school, but this racial bias starts in the preschool level, where Black kids are about 3.6 times more likely at the preschool level to be expelled. Mm-hmm. We see this within bail processes, where you bake into these systems the perceptions, whether it's Black children or Black adults, the perceptions of criminality, which, as said in that video, that often end up with African Americans getting higher bail. But when it affects entire systems. I was out in Rikers Island talking to kids, children, teenagers who had been there for 6 months, a year, folks like Khalif Browder. It's outrageous.
Senator Harris, I mean, back on this risk assessment where sort of people are assigned a number of risk and that'll determine sort of whether or not they're allowed out. People would say, as much as you try, racism is baked into the algorithm.
Well, it is, because, for example, an obvious flaw, I think everybody here in a risk assessment system would be take into account the number of times this person has been arrested.
Right.
Well, we know Black and brown men in particular are arrested at a much higher rate than their counterparts for the same kind of activity.
So
right?
you might have a higher risk assessment number, even though you're really being harassed, essentially.
Right, even though you didn't commit a crime. Right? So we have to look at, you're absolutely right, we have to look at, Ina's right, we have to look at these risk assessment systems and understand how they bake into it racism, the institutional racism that is in the system, because we know that if you look at arrest rates, you look at the amount of bail that Black and brown men in particular are charged, it is higher than their white counterparts for the same kind of offense. And then look at it in terms of the story that you shared in losing your children. You know, this is the reality of what happens. So the average American does not have $25,000 sitting around. And then where do they go? They got to go across the street to the bail bondsman, who says, well, I'll give you, the average bail in the United States is $10,000. I'll give you the money, but you've got to give me 10%, which you will not get back. Well, the average American doesn't have $1,000 sitting around. Plus, for a person who's got money, when they give the bail to the court, if they show up, they get it back. For folks who don't have that kind of money, you give that money to the bail bondsman, you don't get that back, because that's the cost of getting the bail. So there's a premium on Black people in terms of economic injustice as well as an injustice in the criminal justice system. And so it's about what we're doing around looking at those risk assessment systems. Let me just tell you, under this administration's Department of Justice, I do not believe they should be allowed to write these risk assessment systems at all. Let's look.
Let me bring in Rashad Robinson. He's in our audience, and he's an activist. He's the executive director of Color of Change. Will you stand up for me, Rashad? I know that you often give people advice, and you've had a long history of really sort of engaging people in activism around these issues. What is one piece of advice for people who are trying to figure out how to work against an issue that sometimes seems too big for one person?
Well, first of all, people have to act locally. The vast majority of people are incarcerated at the local level, and bail in our communities is a local issue. And we've got to sort of hit it at the root. First, we've got to hold political leaders, whether they be state legislators or prosecutors, to actually do something about bail. And then, as we ask our politicians what they're going to do about it, this is not just simply about the law, but about the fact that locking up Black people is big business. And there are major insurance companies that profit because they back the bail bonds industry. In fact, about over $2 billion of money is made off of the locking up of folks through bail by major insurance companies that are largely unregulated. In order to get at mass incarceration, we have to look at not just the criminal justice system, but the economics of who's making money off it and hold them accountable as well.
I couldn't agree more. Part of the analysis of the failure of the criminal justice system in our country has got to be who is profiting off of incarcerating folks. Because when you look at that, it's about the insurance company. It's also about these private prisons, which are literally profiting off the incarceration of human beings. And so we have to look at the financial incentives. And then on the other side, look at actually the return on investment for not incarcerating people, especially for crimes for which we just know that incarceration should not be the response.
Congresswoman Bass.
Yeah, let me just say that in California, they did pass a bail reform. And the second they passed it, and you know this, Senator, the second they passed it, what happened? The industry went to court. And now, and the industry went to court, but also there's a counter ballot initiative to change it. But I want to get back to the question that you asked, which was how can we reimagine public safety? And I believe that you can. 19 years ago, I started an organization called Community Coalition in South Central Los Angeles. And our whole goal was how can we address crime on a neighborhood level without calling the police? And so what we did was we organized the community stayed involved. We found a lot of different reasons why crime was happening, and we went to the source. So there are ways to reimagine public safety. There are things that we can do. But the question is what you raised, which is who is profiting off the system. Where in the world would you have prisons on the stock exchange? Private prisons are on the stock exchange.
We're going to take
That's
a short
crime
break.
in and of
We'll come
itself.
back. We're going to continue our conversation about mass incarceration.